right, so the following piece first appeared on my Substack. You should really check it out. So I was reading C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man the other day, and it's a great book, by the way. And I was struck by this passage. It's from the essay Men Without Chests. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our society needs is more drive or dynamism or self-sacrifice or creativity. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. Now, I don't know about you, I haven't castrated any geldings recently, but I understand what Lewis is saying. He's essentially saying that our society asks us to be noble and virtuous without actually giving any direction on what that is, and in fact, denying that those things exist. We deny that there is objective truth, beauty, goodness, and yet expect of our citizens virtue, enterprise, things that relativity, it can't, if all things are relative, why aspire to anything, right? But anyway, for context, again, what Lewis is addressing here is our propensity to reject the objective and yet demand of our people the very virtues that we have rendered relative. I personally couldn't agree more with Lewis. After reading that passage, I was quickly lost in thoughts of heroes, of great deeds, of virtue and piety, of duels and honor killings, of the deaths of rappers or the Hatfield-McCoy feud. For context, the Hatfield-McCoy feud was these two families, I think in Tennessee or West Virginia. It's not really important. Early United States, they were killing each other in droves. It was cycles of violence. It was all because one person from one family snubbed the other on a random Tuesday, and then they killed each other for like a decade. But that was based off of a sense of honor that they had. So interesting, right? Or toxic masculinity, and where the line is. But then once more, I'm thinking of Leonidas, Pyrrhus of Epirus, Winston Churchill, Hamilton, Augustus, Teddy Roosevelt, Washington, and many more. I wanted to understand why we no longer foster great men, what that greatness even entails, and what losing it truly means. In doing so, I hope to shed some light on these questions, but I'm well aware that I may raise more questions than I answer, and the general shape of this essay will appear more like a long list of questions than a succinct treatise. So be it. For a long list of questions is always far superior to an inadequate and neat bundle of answers. So with all that in mind, let's begin. And I mean, yeah, like, these are interesting questions. Would we have Alexander Hamilton without what today we would call toxic masculinity? I don't think so. I think the very thing that made Alexander Hamilton great was was adversely the thing that got him killed. I don't think he would have, written the Federalist Paper in whatever it was, like 50 days, with the help of Madison, of course, and one other guy who I'm forgetting the name of. If he didn't also have this just, drive, this thumos, this dynamism that also led him to get, shot and ultimately die. So not only a tragic figure, but an interesting question, right? Can we have heroism without the negative implications that comes with it? I certainly have my opinion, but let's keep reading. The inversion. Okay, this section is called the inversion, and this is about what we honor. And I think this is really important to understand honor itself in terms of why do we honor things and what do we choose to honor. So I think it's rightly said that the greatest honor ought to be awarded to the highest and most noble things. The person who saves their nation ought to receive more honor than the person who saves their town, and that person ought to receive more honor than the person who saves their friend. This honor ought to be bestowed upon them in proportion to their labor, and as such, they ought to be honored in ascending order. Yet today, these are not the people we honor. We shower them in neither praise nor wealth, and instead give our attention to the people least deserving of it. And by the way, this isn't a moral statement about the fact that, if you save your friend from drowning versus save your nation from invasion, that one person is worth more than the other, and that a nation is worth more than the life of a friend. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm talking more classically about great deeds. I think Jan Sobieski saving Poland from the Ottomans when they were invading is a greater deed than someone saving their friend. That's not to say both don't, require a degree of risk. However, honor is not a private thing. It requires other people. It is always a public virtue because you need people to bestow the honor. Therefore, what is honored highest affects the most people because then they can give the most honor in return. And that's why, Sobieski saving Poland deserves the most honor. Right. Anyway, simple stuff, but just figured I would make that clear. Now, but these, again, are not the people that we honor. So it's really the serial killer, not the detective, who gets the Netflix documentary. The school shooter, not the soldier, who grabs headlines. And the OnlyFans porn star, not the saint, who garners attention. Many will say that this reality just reflects the marketability of sex and violence over virtue and good character. This is not necessarily true. While man throughout time has had his morbid curiosities and a penchant for lust, it wasn't until recently that he began venerating those things as we do today. The bards of the Middle Ages spoke of chivalric knights and heroic quests, and while these quests could certainly include violence or love, they were a just violence and a just love, not warped modern depictions. A knight might have cut down 100 men in battle, but no bard of yore has doth made public any tales of the maiden Bonnie Blue sleeping with 100 men in a day. I mean, so true, right? And I mean, yeah, we have a penchant for, violence and lust. These things fascinate us. There's a famous Socratic dialogue where a man is walking through the Piraeus in Athens, which was just basically like a market that they used to have there. And he sees some dead bodies off to the side, and he really wants to look at them, and he curses his own eyes. He's like, curse you eyes for wanting to, look upon such a ghastly sight, or whatever he says. But I think that does speak to something that's very true in human nature. We're fascinated by death. We're fascinated by sex. They're kind of polar opposites in a sense. They're two extremes of life. And so yeah, they're fascinating. But I just watched It's a Wonderful Life the other day. That movie doesn't have any sex or any violence. It's a fantastic freaking movie. And beyond that, I think if you go back to the Middle Ages, or even more recently to our country's founding, you had these strict honor codes, and these things really had a lot of buy-in from the public. This is what people really believed in this. If you talked trash about someone, you could end up like Hamilton in a duel. Look at Andrew Jackson, many such cases. And so what's marketable is in many ways what's posited by society. And while sex and violence are certainly marketable in the most base way, that's not to say you can't market other things and make them worth pursuing. However, this is precisely what we do today. Chastity is not a virtue, but a sign of either religiosity, itself a sign of backwards prejudice, or ugliness. For what woman or man in their right mind want to save themselves for the loving confines of marriage when they could be used and manipulated while simultaneously lowering their chances for long-term monogamous success? This goes across the board for all the virtues. We've essentially inverted what, even 150 years ago, was considered honorable. This inversion is a problem because when society posits something as good, then people naturally seek its fulfillment. And if our society posits vice as virtue, this means everyone will be running in the same direction towards the wrong thing. As Thucydides noted in his History of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens was falling into madness during the reign of the demagogue Cleon, notably followed right after by Alcibiades, not a great leader himself either, though a real looker apparently. And I quote Thucydides here, "Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal ally. Moderate caution was called cowardice. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness, and prudent hesitation was specious cowardice." All this to say, when societies lose their foundations, virtue and vice tend to swap names. We seem to be living through our own corruption of language. Is it not possible that courage is now deemed toxic, that cowardice is now deemed sensitivity and emotional intelligence, that honor-seeking is now merely the sign of a fragile ego, that dignity and chastity have become insecurity, and that abandonment of duty is now seen as setting boundaries? I personally think this might be the case. I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, that being said, but I mean, I can think of many friends of mine coming to me and being like, hey, I don't know if I want my girlfriend going out to this club or this bar. I've certainly had those feelings myself, and I know it's a common sentiment shared online as well. And you really question yourself because your society is telling you that, no, it's okay, let her go do whatever she wants. And in many ways, yeah, I think in some ways I'm kind of for that, right? I'm not trying to be Islam here. I'm not trying to tell her you got to wear this and you can't go out in public, whatever. But on the other side of things, I definitely think when you're in a relationship, there is a degree of chastity and dignity that has to be upheld for the good of the relationship. And, our society would posit that that's insecurity. Me personally, I don't feel that way. And so I raise these questions. Have we flipped vice and virtue in our modern society? Like Thucydides said was done in Athens around his time. Perhaps. If these observations raise a deeper question, is it sufficient for a hero to achieve that which their society posits as noble? Because again, in this case, if I do what my society posits as noble, I mean, my girlfriend's going to the club every single night, you know what I mean? Or other examples that I gave. So it's an interesting question. Or must the hero surpass the expectations of society? And does this require the opportunity to do so, or can it be done anytime? It's a great question, Could Napoleon have existed if the French Revolution hadn't happened just before his rise to prominence? Perhaps more troubling, by what standard does a hero surpass society's expectations? If society itself has become corrupted, if it honors vice and mocks virtue, then the hero who surpasses society's expectations might simply be exceeding in vice. The truly heroic person might have to reject society's honors altogether. But then, how do we distinguish the genuine hero from the mere contrarian, the saint from the narcissist, who simply refuses to play by the rules? Can there even be heroes in a society that has abandoned heroism? Or does such a society produce only celebrities, influencers, and the infamous? Right now I'm thinking of Clavicular. He just ran over some guy, We really don't, what would give you attention in the past was, great deeds. Even Napoleon, say what you will about the guy, he was this great general who was serving his country. Now we can just serve ourselves and record ourselves being narcissistic, essentially, and garner attention that way. It's kind of, I genuinely feel like the streaming space and Instagram is just an absolute freak show. Even some of the creators I like, and I don't know why I'm shooting shots, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Even some of the creators I like, they're reacting to other people reacting to a video, or they're reacting to another video, and then they're putting it out. And it's just an absolute slop simulacra. And yet this is what's garnering attention for them, more than the guy who slaves away in your cafe writing a novel that no one's ever going to read. And maybe it's a shitty novel, but maybe he's the next James Joyce. You never know. But anyway, I'm going to keep reading. And here we stumble upon what might be the deeper question. Is it possible that we've lost our conception of honor, not because we have too little, but because we have too much? That we've inherited multiple incompatible visions of what makes someone admirable and found ourselves paralyzed by the choice? This is a fair point. As a young jit, you're faced with, do I become Andrew Tate, or do I become, a looks maxer, or do I become Dean Wither, or whatever that guy's name is, right? Or Hassan Piker. That's the real choice. Hassan Piker and Nick Fuentes. What do you become, right, as a young man? No, but seriously, at a deeper level, what is going on? Are we paralyzed by a choice between two archetypes? So let's dig into that right now. So Nietzsche famously made the distinction between master and slave morality. This is in the Genealogy, if any of you have read it. Master morality is defined by the will to power, conquest, and the pursuit of glory. We can imagine Achilles or Hercules, proud, but because they are worthy of praise, like that of Aristotle's great-souled man, and synonymous with the Greek word thumos, meaning spirited. On the other side of this dichotomy, we have what Nietzsche called slave morality, which is most closely aligned with Christian morality, characterized by humility, charity, and self-sacrifice. And I think these two archetypes are most clearly stated by the heroes of these two kind of ways of thinking. And I think we can think of Achilles, who has a lot of pride and arrogance, but is also this great warrior who dominates his foes. And we have Christ, who wins the hearts of his foes and actually sacrifices himself. And these are two diametrically opposed archetypes of a heroic figure, and also, as such, constitute two different forms of morality and moral systems. One which is, represented by the will of the stronger, the will to power, and the other one which is represented by humility and charity and grace and all of these things. Terrence Malick, actually. Terrence Malick, I apologize. He talks about this a lot, especially in his movie The Tree of Life, which is probably one of the greatest movies ever made. If you haven't seen it, you have to watch it. But the father in that movie represents the way of nature, which is this more thumatic master morality, and the mother represents the way of grace, which is this more subdued, graceful. And Malick doesn't make a point to say, one is truly worse than the other, but that they, create a real different way of existing in the world. So it's worth considering. But according to Nietzsche, this divide goes far deeper than just pagan and Christian ethics, but pervades morality itself. Any moral framework that venerates humility and seeks to aid the meek is slavish and Christian, with liberalism, feminism, democracy, and whatever else being nothing but secular instantiations of this morality. And on the other side, any system that welcomes strength, beauty, and vitality, while scorning what is weak, be that fascism, aristocracy, or paganism, serves as a manifestation of this view. I've found interesting what I would only call a resurgence of pagan thinking and pagan belief, especially on the right wing. You have a lot of people, right now there's an immigration crisis going on in Europe, and there's a lot of questions about what is, Western Europe's actual identity, and what is the identity of these countries, and do they have a right to enforce their borders, so on and so forth. And you have a lot of people who are on the right-wing side of things who are saying, well, Western Europe is Christian in nature and all these things. But then you've got this, group that's further off that's kind of got this master morality, overman, Nietzschean kind of thinking, these pagans, I think best represented probably by like Bronze Age Pervert on Twitter, if any of you guys are aware of him. Personally don't subscribe to this way of thinking, but who say, actually, no, the West is not Christian at its roots, but pagan. And we have to get back to the old gods and the old ways, and a thumatic spirit and just conquest, right? And all that which is weak should be subjugated. And obviously the Nazis felt similarly. That's kind of the thinking that led to the concentration camps. But that's not to say like vitality and things like that are necessarily bad concepts. But I do think the political instantiations of them can get dangerous, but so can liberalism. You know what I mean? And I think we've seen that. I think the reason the West is questioning its identity, it actually is because of liberalism too. So, both have their issues. But this isn't about the political systems. This is about the two different types of moralities. And this might be what we're trying to, we're having a difficulty deciding between. So all our modern confusion really may be rooted in this fundamental divide. Perhaps there is a war in the heart of modern man between Rome and Judea, and he is deciding whether to be Christ or Caesar. Worse yet, he lacks the clarity to choose, for as we have already said, he has no chest. He has no place from which to decide on objective values, because his society already doesn't believe in those. His society is relativistic. Even the will to power requires a sense that one is on a grand stage. And how can one be bothered to care for his neighbor if we are all just floating on a rock and nothing matters? If this war does exist, it would seem both sides are losing, not to each other, but to a far more sinister rationalism that drains man of his thumos and his saintliness alike. This is an interesting point, you know what I mean? I do think there's a battle in a lot of us, who do we want to be? But I think ultimately, the brutal thing is, fully going for either of those two archetypes that we see doesn't actually feel like an option, because we all subscribe to what C.S. Lewis in Surprised by Joy calls a glib and shallow rationalism. This kind of irony with everything. Think about meme culture, right? It's not that deep, bro. Grown-ass man, by the way. All these things that just completely reduce the phenomena of life, And how can you want to go be a Napoleon anymore? All it takes is one person, filming you and going, oh, it's not that deep, bro, while you're off on your Napoleonic quest, or you're really striving for greatness and someone just calls you corny and your career's over just like that. We really do have this kind of toxic irony and rationalism that I think, while there is definitely a war between being Christ and Caesar, being the Chad who goes and hooks up with a bunch of women, or being the based Orthodox schema monk who hides away and just prays and is trad, right? But even picking one of those archetypes is hard because, again, all it takes is one person calling you a cornball, and that's it. It's over for you. But what if this entire time I've been asking the wrong question? Perhaps I'm already making the same mistake in framing the problem this way, as if choosing between Rome and Judea were the answer. Both traditions exist, within what Lewis calls the Tao, a term borrowed from Chinese philosophy meaning the way. The Tao represents objective moral reality itself, the deep-rooted ground of value that all great civilizations have recognized, albeit in different ways. Rome's honor and Jerusalem's charity are both branches of this deeper tree. The chest, that seat of the virtues where sentiment and reason meet, where we feel duty as binding rather than optional, is formed within the Tao. And this is a really crucial point. This rationalism that we have nowadays, this irony and this rationalism, tries to stand outside of tradition itself and judge everything inside of it. Whereas, yes, Christianity and paganism have different views of the world, but they still both believe in objective reality and truth and beauty and goodness, and are just approaching that beauty and goodness from different perspectives. But that's not the same thing as saying, well, those things don't exist at all, right? So, and here, is where our deepest problem reveals itself. We moderns keep demanding that the Tao justify itself to us. Prove to me why I should be honorable. Justify courage. Give me a rational foundation for heroism. We want the Tao to present itself and its credentials before we submit to it. This is what Lewis meant when he said we cannot hold a pistol to the head of the Tao and demand it justify itself. You cannot prove the foundations, for they are what make proof possible. You cannot justify reason without using reason. You cannot demonstrate the value of courage without already valuing something. Every argument requires premises, and at some point, you either see it or you don't. This is a crucial point. The logic I'm using to construct my argument only works if we go off of the first principles of logic, which is that, true premises lead to a true conclusion, and ideas around contradiction and so forth. But if we just say, oh, we don't believe in that system of logic anymore, there's not much I can't use logic to get back to that system because unfortunately, logic is still working from a foundation that it can't actually prove. And that's really the problem, is that if you're going to ascribe any value, you're essentially using value in some capacity, right? Perhaps the ancients, both Rome and Jerusalem, pagan and Christian, were in touch with the truth we have forgotten, that certain truths are known by doing, not by analyzing. Pyrrhus of Epirus didn't learn courage by studying it, but by living it. And Lincoln didn't become honorable by demanding that honor prove itself worthy of his allegiance. We moderns want to evaluate all traditions from outside tradition itself, to stand nowhere and judge everything. But this stance is impossible, or rather, it's just another tradition pretending to be none, with its own unexamined premises about neutrality, rationality, and progress. The problem isn't that we can't choose between Christ and Caesar, but between the humble servant and the proud warrior. The problem is that we think we can choose without being anything first. We think we can judge Rome and Jerusalem from some third position that is somehow above or beyond both. But there is no such position. We're always already somewhere, formed by some tradition, standing within the Tao, even if it's just the tradition of rejecting tradition. Let that sink in, all you realists out there. And the irony is that by trying to stand outside all traditions, to evaluate them objectively, we've made ourselves incapable of inhabiting any tradition genuinely. We've become what Lewis called men without chests, neither masters nor servants, neither Romans nor Christians, neither proud nor humble. We have the head, the intellect that analyzes and critiques, and the belly, the appetites that desire comfort and pleasure. But we've lost the chest, the seat of the virtues, the place where duty and honor reside. This is why we laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. This is why we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. We've cut out the chest and expected to make men capable of nobility. Can we recover? Perhaps, but not by further analysis, further questioning, or more standing outside to evaluate. Perhaps only by the humility to enter a tradition, to be formed by it, to practice virtues before we fully understand them. Perhaps only by what Solzhenitsyn called a spiritual upsurge, a recovery of the sense that we are on a grand stage, that there are heights to reach for and depths to avoid, that how we live matters, not just to us, but absolutely. Perhaps then we might have heroes. That concludes part one of my inquiry into heroism. I think it's an important point to end on. We touched on some good points, like what is it we honor? How does honor work as a mechanism? It's obviously a social thing. You can't just have honor just by chilling. You have to have people around that you help and you do deeds for, and then they honor you, and so on and so forth. Then we touched on what I think is the main divide between a lot of people, and that is, do I become the Sigma male Chad who sleeps with all the women, the Andrew Tate, the Caesar, the Augustus, whatever, or do I become the Schema monk, the Christian, the trad husband, whatever you want to call it? And I'm not saying that's all people. There's different archetypes, but I think within those, like, if you're going to be more of a leftist, perhaps, maybe you don't want to be a trad Christian. The thing is, Nietzsche would say, you're still engaging in slave morality because you are trying to uphold the virtues of the meek, versus are you going to be some nationalist or fascist or something like that? You are still trying to uphold the virtues of the strong. And that's really what the fundamental divide is, which is the morality of the strong and the weak. So we touched on that. That was good. But then we also touched on the fact that both of those are losing the battle to glib, shallow rationalism and irony. And then finally, we noted the fact that standing outside of traditions and trying to analyze them is never going to work, because certain things you can only come to understand their virtues by entering into them as a tradition. And also by noting that the tradition of examining is still a tradition nonetheless, even though it pretends to be neutral, right? And I thought this would be a good place to end this one, because I think in the next few iterations of this investigation into heroism, I think we're going to actually dive into the different traditions and actually try to get a real feel for them on their own terms, and then evaluate their merits based on that, based on their own terms, not based on some detached neutral position. But yeah, again, this piece first aired on my Substack. That's really what I put the majority of my time into. And so definitely go check it out over there. Subscribe to me over there. That means the most, supports me the most. But also, I mean, if you enjoyed this, a sub here is huge. I would definitely appreciate it. And yeah, let's keep it rolling. I mean, we're coming into 2026 hot. Let's go. Come on.